Okay, so I'm going to condense all of Hinduism into its most compressed form, and then we'll see if that is works as an analogy to explain everything. So we'll start off. Where do we start? We can always start with suffering. Why is there suffering? Why are we here? The big questions, right? What's the fundamental model of reality? So think of an analogy, think of the analogy. So the thing about understanding is that it can't be just an intellectual, strictly an intellectual understanding. It can't be just something that you've learned. It has to be something also, the explanation of it has to include your experience. So that's why I believe that the fundamental, like the final truth, the theory of everything, is metaphor. It has to be metaphor because metaphor infers experience. It's like this, and you've had that like experience, right? So usually an accurate metaphor just goes, oh, yes. And the reason why metaphor and analogy work so well is because there is only one fundamental process. And everything that appears out of that process. There's only one thing going on, and that's why everything appears holographic in nature and fractal. It's all based on the fundamental process. So the fundamental process, and this is Wheeler's participatory universe, and he drew this in his attempt to explain the findings of quantum mechanics, and that is the role of the observer in the manifestation of all this. It requires a conscious observer for all of this to occur, for all of this, for the one to appear. So I will include in the video, in the description of the video, the video, a link to the video that shows this precisely, like the best metaphor for awareness coming back onto itself, and that is the video of a camera pointed at the screen of a television, and it's recording its own focusing. So the image that appears on the screen isn't an object, right? It's not like it's filming a three-dimensional object and projecting it on the screen. It's just projecting its own awareness, if you will. So that's how the entire universe arises, the appearance of the entire universe arises from awareness just coming back onto itself. So go check out that video that's in the link. All right, so think of looking into a mirror. You can say, that's me, while simultaneously possessing the inherent intuition, I am not that, right? Same as a video game, same as an actor playing a character. I am the character is not me, right? It's all there's acting because this is a grand act. You see, this is another fractal way the universe works is that we have acting and pretending and playing because that's what God is doing. This is God's act, your act. All right, so this act began. So the relationship, so in Hinduism, it just like every other religion. I love it, but it gets convoluted. It gets too complicated. There's Ishvara, and there's all these gods. There's Shiva and Kali and Krishna, and then there's Ishvara, which is God. But then there's Brahman and Atman. Like where, like there's it. I'm sorry, we're just gonna pare it down. We only need Brahman and Atman. Anything beyond that is convoluted, and it doesn't have to be. There's no need for all these other gods popping up. So 0 and 1. So 0 is actually the correct representation of unity, of singularity, right? Of singular. Because there is nothing here that can be said to be 2, unless you look at, if you say that there's a side to that line and then there's another side to that line, that's the only way that you could really say that this is 2 in any way. It's just 1, right? But the 1, which is interesting because it's supposed to represent 1, it has dualistic properties, doesn't it? So this is where, so this is actually, I kind of misnamed the fundamental model of reality because this is actually the most fundamental model of reality, and that arises because the 1 has polarity, right? There's something in the 1, the line, the one-dimensional expression, that has 2 to it, right? It has poles, it has ends, it has a beginning and an end. You draw it, it has a beginning and an end. This has no beginning and no end. The only beginning and end that this has is the actual drawing of it, right? So anyway, so yeah, so this is where my fundamental model of reality comes in, is when you further investigate the atman, it develops into duality. And another way that this develops into duality is that if you still recognize that that's me and I'm not that, then this is the relationship of Brahman and Atman, right? You can look at yourself in the mirror and say, okay, that's me, but I'm not that. But when we entered this game, this world, we assumed, we got so interested. Isn't it, there was a guy that looked into the water so closely and valued himself so much that he fell in? Isn't that a story? So we're taking ourselves, Brahman is taking itself to be Atman. So it's basically forgetting that you're Brahman, and Atman becomes, at that point, Atman becomes ego because it keeps going. And that's 1 becomes 2. So even in mathematics, 0 and 1 are not 2. So how can that be, right? It looks obvious when it's like, okay, there's 1 and then there's 2. There's 2 things here. But that's the problem, is that we cannot represent the absolute. It is not a part of the system. The source, the base of a system, is not a part of that system. So here's how. So here's how the system works. Is that you enter the game, and then you come around, and then you come back to it, right? Let's say you start there, and you go all the way around, and then you end up back where you started. So the way the game is constructed is that it's a forgetting, right? It's also a forgetting. You forget that you're the absolute, and you think that you're this now. So the way it's rigged, the way that it's programmed, is that if you come back to the beginning and you remember, you recognize the beginning as the self, you come to remember before you get back to yourself, to the beginning where you started, home, whatever. Then you that's it. You've won the game. You're no longer in the delusion that you're this, just this, and you're home. But if you don't recognize by the time you come around to self again, if you don't if you're still in delusion, then you're around again and around, and it becomes, the representation of that is a spiral then, right? Not a circle, because you've missed the point. It's moved. You've moved in time or something, and you've literally missed the point, and you just keep going. So that's the cyclical nature of samsara. So the way in which the problem is, what happens is that if you don't recognize this, we always will have this inherent intuition, I'm not that. That will never go away. And that's the nagging feeling that starts the search, right? The spiritual search, everything that we're doing, we're searching for that remembrance. So having the intuition that this isn't really us, because this is relative and that's absolute. So this requires this for the reflection in the mirror requires that which is looking into the mirror, but that which is looking into the mirror doesn't require for its existence the reflection, correct? So if we take it, when we take ourselves to be this, we still have that intuition, oh, this isn't really me. So what we do if we're not aware of this, is that what we can do is just project something. We project something, another thing, whether it's subtle like mind, but it's not zero. We would put negative over here. This could actually be positive, right? And then this would be negative, because we project something relative to us, because we have that intuition that this is only a relative existence. So then that becomes the system then. It's like two mirrors facing each other. You basically project another mirror, and then we still don't see what's in here, and then these two mirror realms are actually reflecting what's going on in the middle, but it appears as though there's a causal relationship between, so this is now a positive and this is a negative, because we've projected something. So it's always this. It's always going to come up positive and negative if you keep going like this, because the system, it turns into a Ponzi scheme. The system is trying to be its own source, you see? So that's why we come up with thoughts and math. So these mirror images, they're infinite, right? They at the speed of light, they expand infinitely, and depending on which mirror image you believe you're taking to be fundamental reality at that point, the other one will appear to be relative, and the one that you're at, you will take to be absolute. And then if you take yourself to be body, then it looks like mind and thoughts are relative and the base is the physical. And if you flip it around the other way, because we're so aware of both now, we're so aware of ourselves that you get, no matter which mirror you assume to be absolute reality, the other one will seem to be causal in relationship to it. But they're not causal at all. They're correlated, but they're not causal. So that's how we get, that's why mathematics and language itself, the English language, is inverted. It's completely inverted because we've taken this to be the reality, right? So in the number system and in language, the zero is no thing, right? Something, nothing, everything, nothing, anything. The thing is taken to be the source, fundamental reality. And thing is a physical object, right? A thing is, the connotation is that it's a physical object. So materialism has taken the physical world to be fundamental. So that's why in the number system, the zero is, first of all, it's incorrect to include it in the system, because zero is not the lack of things. Zero is the source of things. But because we have it inverted, we think the things are fundamental, and therefore everything that isn't a thing just doesn't even exist. So that's how the number system is wrong, is it should not include source in the system. The source is transcendent of the system. So, and this is the same relationship as I and the Father are one, right? Zero, God and Jesus are not two. And that, again, the closest, I think, the closest analogy that we can use is an actor playing a character, right? The character is the actor, but the actor is not the character. So how do we break out of this? How do we come to remember, before this huge cycle is done, how do we come to remember that we're this and not be deluded to believing that we're this and mind, right? This, which includes body mind. This is the identity, and this is body, and this is mind, right? So how do we get away from that? Well, it's very simple, that we just turn our attention away from the mirror image. We just simply look at ourselves. We can't look at ourselves. The eye can't look at itself, can it, without the mirror? But it's not complicated. I don't want to make it sound like it's complicated to try to get out, how to get out of this. Is that we just have to not take all of this to be so real. And the way in which we do that is we take attention away from it. That which is paid most attention to will appear as the reality at that time. So whatever you put your attention on appears to be real at that time. But it's the attention that is the reality. It's the awareness. It's the awareness. Well, consciousness can be awareness of something, but being is just the awareness. Like in dreamless sleep, there's just being, and there's no content. There's just awareness, there's no content in the awareness. But that's not zero, right? We think that dreamless sleep is nothing, and that death is nothing, that it's a lack, but it's actually the source. So can you imagine what it's like to be existence itself? Not to be alive, but to be life. That's what you are. You're life itself. So there's nothing to fear about being Brahman. It's not a lack or a void. It's absolute fullness and contentment and completion. So don't take this so fucking seriously. And don't engage in it so much. It's not important. Maya keeps wanting to pull your attention away from source. And that's everything. Everything is vying for your attention. That's the game. So don't give it your attention. Stay inward. Inward. Just be. And mathematicians are still going to math, and science is still going to science. And most of humanity is going to go through hell and extinction. But your world is not that world. Another thing about quantum mechanics is that, and this multiverse nonsense, is the multiverse is here. If we just look at each individual life as its own world, right? Then it all is here. That's such a cop-out. That's not an answer to anything. It's just, oh, it's infinite and anything can happen. That's a cop-out. That's no answer at all. A little bit of a tangent there. So just keep things simple. The simplest explanation includes, and complete explanation, comprehensive, is simple, it's obvious, and it includes metaphor. It has to, because you don't know baseball by just reading the rules of baseball and reading the history of baseball and reading all the stats. And if you knew everything about baseball and had never played baseball, you don't know baseball, do you? So a complete understanding requires intuition, it requires analogy, and then to interpret that analogy requires some intuition. So this is why logic doesn't work. Pure logic, just on its own, is insufficient for coming to some sort of the ultimate truth. And yet, they will still do it, won't they? They won't admit that science is inadequate, even though science itself has shown scientists that it's inadequate. So, meditate, turn away from the screen and everything that mind has produced, and turn inward and find yourself.